Wow. That was an opening.
All right, Stephanie, I'll hand it to you just for a quick good morning, but we're going to scoot through the logistics today.
Yeah, just good morning, all. Welcome. What did you just say? Our 23rd meeting, I think. Welcome to our 23rd meeting. Hard to believe. And let's keep going. Trace, you lead us on.
Perfect. All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. We've got a 2-hour meeting today. We're going to stay full group, culmination of our last 3 meetings as subcommittee groups, really just an opportunity to review work to date. And want to just be super clear. This is for the data and the specialized occupation subcommittee. Assuming that we get through the conversations today that we need to get through, to get the feedback on all draft recommendations, we'll then be moving forward out of this conversation in our next meeting. So that's the goal today. We'll spend about an hour in data and an hour in specialized occupations, and see where we get. So I know that folks have not had an opportunity to review. So that's a big part of today. And we want to make sure that we're being inclusive of folks' needs. So if you need more time ever, or you feel like we're rushing through, or that you need it presented differently, just drop me a note and let me know. The goal is not that we're moving you through too quickly that you don't feel like you can comprehend where things are. So just let us know. We're going to start with data, and then we're going to go into specialized occupations. I'm going to anything else, Doris, that I'm missing before we kind of jump in?
No, so we will share out the full set of draft recommendations in a PDF. Tracy's going to pop that in the chat. But we also have a slideshow that we'll use for those of you who want to be able to see it on the screen while we walk through. We're gonna do that as well. So and again, to Tracy's point, if there's a point, if you need more time, or you have a question, clarifying question, just send us a note offline, and we'll add that clarity. So we want to make sure that, again, to Tracy's point, that that folks are tracking and that we're meeting folks' different needs in digesting information.
Thanks, Doris. Okay, I dropped the link in. And yeah, Crystal, appreciate that. Brian and Jordan really cranked on the writing of this. So big kudos to you all. And I think they did a really great job of capturing first round of draft recommendations, which I want to just underscore that this is the same process we followed in previous subcommittees, which is, we had the meetings and then we all came together and we gave broader feedback. And these are not the final recommendations. This is so that we feel like when we get time to be voting around final report time, that we feel like we actually have a real pulse on where the group is and that the recommendations are reflective of that. So just keep that in mind. This is not the time to kind of go down the rabbit hole on wordsmithing and whatnot, unless it's something that truly changes the meaning of what we're trying to say. But these are draft, and that's the purpose. And we'll do more surveying and polling around final recommendations. So today is really just feedback on the content. We'll have, and I also just want to name that the committee, subcommittee members, this is the first time you're seeing the draft of the final kind of like draft recommendations. So we're going to start with you all in our conversations and make sure that, from your perspective, we're not missing something glaring that you all feel like we landed on. And then we'll open it up full group for some key questions around, what are thoughts, what questions do folks have, what concerns do folks have, any aha moments, that sort of thing. So with that said, I dropped in the PDF in the chat. Let me know if anybody has any access issues there. They go in order of data and specialized occupations. Please stick squarely in the data subcommittee right now, because that's what we're going to be discussing. And then we'll do more review time for the specialized occupation, but we want to make sure that we utilize our time best. So, Doris, what do you think?
Yep, sounds
7
good.
minutes? How much time do we need?
To let them let's pull up. Can we pull up the slide on the first directive real quick?
Yeah.
Or do you want to just let them read through it all?
I was just going to let them read first, and then we'll go through the slides.
Yeah, we'll start with 7 minutes, and then we can do a time check at that point to see if anyone needs more time.
Cool. All right, so 7 minutes. Click into that PDF I shared. You're just sticking with the top data, and then we'll come back at 8:17. Thanks, y'all. I know we just had a couple folks join. I just dropped a link in the chat for you. We are reviewing the data subcommittee's draft recommendations at the top of that PDF. And we're going to come back at 8:17, having read that. So I think Kelsey, you were the latest one I just saw. So you should see that document I just dropped, and just read the data subcommittee points, and then we'll come back for conversation.
All right, doing a quick time chat. I also put a note in time check. I also put a note in the chat. If anyone needs more time, feel free to message either Trace or myself. Happy to extend the time for a few minutes. Or use your raise hand or thumbs up icon. All right, I don't have any notes. Trace, do you have any notes?
No.
All right, fantastic. Why don't we go ahead and dive in? Do you want me to screen share or are you going to screen share, Trace?
If you can screen share for a minute, that'd be great. I'm finishing mine. Sorry. Do you
No
have,
worries.
are you good?
Yep.
Okay, cool.
Except that I'm disabled.
Oh, I can't do the,
Try it now, Doris.
yeah, try
Yep.
now.
I'm good now. All right, so we are going to start with Directive 18. You may have noticed in the PDF document that the sequencing is the way that we actually discuss these topics, so not the numerical order of the directive. So we're actually starting with Directive 18, analyzing the benefits of an electronic reporting platform for the state. For those of you who can remember way back when we had this conversation, we looked at, some of the other state practices, and we also looked at the Wells County online reporting approach as part of our conversation. And then we conducted a survey. So there was lots of agreement around implementing an electronic reporting platform at the state level. But there was nuance in the conversation. And so attempted to reflect the idea around implementing an electronic reporting platform, and really want to, at this point, open up the floor for our subcommittee to chime in on any clarifying points, whether or not this reflects some of the conversation that we had, and then open the floor to the rest of the group to share their thoughts around this potential recommendation. Michelle?
Yeah, the only thing that I would add that we talked about specific to this directive was, I think that the volume 7 rules and then potentially some statute might need to be adjusted to address the immediacy of reviewing said online reports and then processing of those, because this was the issue of Weld had shared, or Weld's information was that they were not managing that 24/7. Otherwise, people were not seeing that. And there are state rules and regs and I believe statute that requires us to review and disposition those referrals immediately. And so I just think there probably needs to be some language in this recommendation about that. And then I have one other thing as well, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course, Michelle.
So just something that I thought about literally as I was reading this morning. A lot of counties have a blended hotline for adult protection services that goes alongside their child protection. And I know when the statewide hotline was implemented, this was an issue that they were not prepared initially to take adult protection referrals. And people were still calling into those. So if counties direct all of their phone calls to the statewide hotline, for example, they would get a blend of both of those calls. Eventually, the statewide hotline figured that piece out, but this electronic reporting platform would also need to do the same, or have some sort of a way to direct the traffic for adult protection referrals as well.
Thank you, Michelle. Other reflections from our subcommittee on this conversation? Any nuance that we talked about that's not yet reflected in this recommendation or draft recommendation? Hearing none, I don't see anyone hankering to come off mute. No hands raised.
There is a question in
Yeah.
the chat.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. No, I've got it. That's what I was reading. So Don said, would this be where the form would be that screens out an inappropriate report and provides them with the written confirmation?
So the online reporting platform would allow for the report to actually be submitted electronically. It would still need to be screened by an individual to make a determination for screening out or assigning. And so this would not automatic, like we didn't talk about having any kind of automation in the process where, and I don't know that anybody would really want that to make assignment kinds of decisions.
And it can't, we're required to hold red teams in most instances. So this is something that would be generally reviewed the next business day through a red team, or if this, the regulations required not to have a red team, then it had to be reviewed by a couple of staff. Decisions.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I just was wondering because previously we had talked about somewhere being able to access a form where you would be able to see if you should even do a report and getting confirmation back if you were not.
Yeah, so we did talk about in this conversation, and happy to have other folks from the subcommittee chime in. But we did talk about including information on the, wherever it ends up being housed around, what are the statutory requirements around abuse and neglect, and some guidance for potential reporters that actually in other places where they've implemented. That was one of the things that several folks in the subcommittee noted as things that they liked. The fact that you could have some guidance and parameters and some, kind of little bits of education to inform the decision to report or not, as well as a prompt for in, emergency kinds of situations with regards to child abuse or neglect, calling the hotline in lieu of using the online reporting platform. So if it was something that was more emergent around child safety, giving folks information to make the call versus using the online platform. So that came out in our conversation as well. Jade, I see you have your hand up, and then Brian had his hand up and then put it down, I think.
I think related to Don's question, I think it's maybe a note for the final report that if we move forward with both the decision aid tool and this electronic reporting platform, there would be opportunities or recommendations around, interoperability, or how if you do the decision aid tool and it tells you to report, it connects you straight to the electronic reporting platform. I think just making sure that we're clear in our final report that these two things could really work together.
Thank you, Jade.
And yeah, that's a good capture of what I was going to say. Just a reminder that we have talked about alternative processes and services, which include those decision-making tools. So yeah, in the final report, we'll see the interlinking of these recommendations, and it'll be easier to see all these things side by side. But yeah, the two will definitely overlap and interact.
Thank you, Brian. Oh, has my camera been off this whole time? Sorry.
I just thought you were being shy.
I know. I'm so shy. Awesome. Any other comments, questions around this particular draft recommendation? Ida?
Yeah, I had just put this in the chat, but I'm wondering if we need to specify a little bit more beyond just monitoring for any impact on disproportionality, and characterize a response of some kind, whether it's producing a report that's accessible to mandated reporters, or if there's need at the state level to conduct CQI.
Awesome. Thank you, Ida. I love that idea of, making it so that it's used in improving practice and process. Not just, hey, we're monitoring and it's getting worse. Awesome. Thank you. Ashley had a question in the chat around the overall purpose of electronic reporting platform, whether the intent is to make it easier for the reporter or if it's to collect some kind of different data. So the idea was that it would in many instances mimic what happens when a person takes the report, when someone calls the hotline, but to offer an additional mechanism for individuals to make reports and have the opportunity again to provide some written guidance around when reporting is appropriate, but it wasn't to necessarily collect different kinds of data. Did that answer your question, Ashley?
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Awesome, you're welcome. All right, why don't we move to the next directive or draft recommendation? Oh, I'm managing the so you may or may not be able to see this one. It has smaller print because there's more included in here. But this draft recommendation is around the personal information of a child that is collected for a report. And so the recommendations include what's listed here. And one note in the second bullet, you'll see that the word written is highlighted. In the document that you received, it had oral. It was supposed to be written. That was a typo. And so I just highlighted here that that I made that update here on the slide. So this is the actual language. And the rationale behind removing the written reporting requirement is that by and large, this isn't happening. And so it is an attempt to align the statute with what folks are actually doing. I want to pause there and check in with our subcommittee members to see if there's any nuance that we have here that is that's not reflective of our conversation, or any additional comments that you want to make based on the robust discussion that we had. Donna, I see your hand up, and then Brian.
So I dropped this in the chat, but I'm not sure how we missed this, but we need to add race into this sentence. Race and ethnicity are not the same. So we need to highlight that, especially since we're talking about racial disproportionality and disparities. So to leave that out, I think creates a huge issue.
Thank you. Good catch, Donna.
Yeah, if I can address that. The reason, so the where this conversation came from is the bill that was enacted this past year that made new reporting requirements of CDHS, included new categories that weren't already included in the law, that that from the 19.3307 that specifies what categories should be collected. So 19.3307 already includes race, but it doesn't include ethnicity. So adding ethnicity then puts race and ethnicity together. So race is will be a part of the final statute, but right now it only has race. And this adds those new categories in addition to what's already there in 19.3307.
Thank you, Brian. And then Dawn, I see you had this question around disclaimers, and it looks like Michelle responded to that. I just want to make sure that I'm tracking the chat correctly.
Yeah, there is a portion of the statute that talks about that it's a class 3 misdemeanor and punishable by blah, 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 blah. I don't have the exact statute in front of me to reference.
Thank you, Michelle.
I was just wondering if in that online portal that maybe a disclaimer would be visible there for the person completing the form, just as a reminder or that sort of thing. That could be useful because we do see that happen a lot in the childcare industry where someone gets frustrated with their employer or they lose their employment because of something, and then they go and create a report falsely against the program.
Thank you, Dawn. Yeah, this section is really focused on the information that gets collected when a report is made. But I think your point is taken, and we'll add that, just that note in the prior directive that we just talked about online reporting, and maybe that gets captured in kind of the broader narrative around the recommendation, since there's already a requirement or statute that speaks to false reporting. Jessica and then Sam.
Thanks. Yeah. So I wasn't part of this subcommittee, just for the record, but I was kind of curious on one piece, but mostly I had concern around it. So I want to understand kind of more about where the conversation was from. So the part, and technically it's the third bullet point, but really the sub bullet point of number 2, that talks about 19.3.307 subsection 4, stating a written report for persons or officials required by this part 3 to report shall be admissible. So I'm curious, because I feel like I have an idea of where that might have come from, and that we're no longer requiring a written report, so we should strike that piece. But I think that has a pretty unintended consequence of that governs that those reports are admissible in court. They're an important piece, I think, for attorneys to rely upon, that they're admissible as evidence. While I recognize that the written report's no longer required, plenty of reporters, will still write down notes about what happened. They'll write down a report maybe as part of their internal systems, especially I think about in schools and records like that. And so I think that it's important that not be removed, because that's really more about evidentiary admissibility than it is requiring anybody to write a report. And I think it may be just, if that's the case, that it was suggested to be removed because of that, to align with removing the requirement to do a written report. I would just suggest some wordsmithing, of any, written report from people that are required to do this is admissible, although it's not required under reporting. So I just think that it would have, has an unintended consequence of impacting what's admissible in court, and especially going to impact prosecution and defense cases.
So are you, Jessica, are you proposing to amend this quoted section about a written report from persons or officials required by this part? I mean, we just said that it was no longer going to be required, so that part would have to be cleaned up anyway, that it's still admissible. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, so the way I read it is that it's not that a written report is required. What it reads is that a written report from people required to report is admissible, right? So the requirement attaches to those officials in part 3 who are required to report. It's not saying the report is required.
I gotcha.
Right?
Yeah.
So the distinction. So, but I can recognize, a big part of our discussions was like, this is confusing, right? This is a good example of how it's confusing, because I think those could be read different ways. But, any written report from mandatory reporters
is admissible.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is a good point, because it is, I think as it's written right now, it is less clear.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
So you could say, like, while a written report is not required under this section, any written report from those persons, that's just drafting language, right? That's just like legislative language from those persons required to report under this section, or from mandatory reporters, however we want to, we can make it less legalese. The drafters might mess with it, but that's up to them.
Yeah.
Shall be admissible, because that's the important part, is the shall be admissible piece.
Yeah. Thank you, Jessica. Michelle M. and then Michelle D.
Hey, I don't know if this group went into depth. I don't think as a larger group we have around at least the education community's concern with mandatory reporters being called into court in DNNs and or custody proceedings and those sort of things. And what I have always understood to be at least some partial requirement around anonymity, and that helps our teachers do that sometimes. I thought, at least as to DHS, Yeah, Jessica, I'm really interested in being reminded as to what that actually looks like, but I do really, I have concerns with the current state of affairs where those folks can be called into court. I think it's a deterrent. And I think it negatively impacts the child later. But I can see Jessica is very excited to tell me why I'm wrong. So I'm listening.
Well, I do want to pause here because we really are focused. We didn't talk about that as a subcommittee. We really are focused on the information and data that gets collected on a child when a report is made. And in that discussion, the reason why this particular point is included in this draft language around removing the requirement for a written report to follow an oral report is because in practice, that written report in most instances is not being submitted.
And
But we didn't talk
100%
about.
support. I think that what we're talking about now goes beyond the scope of what this recommendation is intended to do. I would caution against us doing that. I think I'm okay with what Jessica's talking about as to other written reports, but a suggestion in the chat about all reports, that feels, and I guess I would consider the written report, that written documentation that we submit later, that we're recommending for elimination. I just don't want to concede the point at this point that all reporters should be subject to subpoenas.
Thank you. Michelle D.
I wonder, I appreciate Jessica's feedback about that because I think she's right. I wonder if there's a way to just shift it to say, should the reporting party choose to submit a written report, it shall be blah, 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 admissible as evidence. But also I think anything in the online reporting platform is also written and should have some sort of a note to say that it is also admissible in court.
Thank you, Michelle. And I like the tie back to the online reporting conversation. And then Sam, you had a question or note in the chat about reflecting how best to reflect biracial or multiracial children. So I was hoping that, if you could come off mute, that would be fantastic, in part because I'd just love to hear your voice. Are you still with us, Sam? If you're speaking, we can't hear you.
I think
Yeah, I'm
Sam
with
put in
you.
the chat that she was having sketchy.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm with y'all. I can hear you, but it was getting a little on and off. So I put the gist of what I wanted to say in the chat. I don't know the best where to note that or how, if that's kind of on the back end system, but I wanted to make that recenter us in that reality.
And that reality being that, for kids who are bi or multiracial, particularly those that may be what I would call Black and, trying to figure out a way to effectively capture that. I love Donna's point that followed, really engaging in respectful inquiry and using the family or child's description as a way of trying to identify, how they self-identify. And then Crystal, you made a note about maybe going back to the Casey data for Colorado and maybe bringing that nuance back into the conversation.
Yeah, I just want to say my understanding was this is how families are identifying, but then it's looking like the disproportionate impact is less than it actually is because those people.
Oh, you cut out again, Sam. I think what you were going to say is because those people, they might self-identify as bi or multiracial, but if they're Black and they're included in the multiracial or biracial category, and it misses that they do actually, maybe have that Black ancestry as well. So it makes it look like the numbers in the Black category are smaller than they actually are when you add in the bi or multiracial. if you're talking, we can't hear you, Sam. So if you can just confirm or not, how I interpreted your understanding, that would be in the chat. That would be fantastic. Michelle, do you still have your hand up, or did you have another question? Okay.
I do. I was wondering, the first bullet, second line at the end of the sentence, they talk about requiring additional characteristics. And then later, I think referring to similar, that word made me go, what's a characteristic? Though I see the list at the end. And then on the third bullet, we refer to demographic information, and I think it may be the same thing. So I just think characteristics without a drop-down menu could bring in a whole lot of information not appropriate at that point.
Thank you for that. And I think, maybe making sure that we're being consistent with the language.
Yeah. Fully supported, of course, just want to be clear.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. Kathy?
So I wasn't a part of this committee, so I don't know if this is the time for me to ask a quick question, but I noticed, I think it's linking a little bit to one of the comments in chat. I remember when we talked about this at the Child Welfare Action Committee many years ago, and one of the challenges sort of felt like when a mandatory reporter would be asked about questions about race, ethnicity, all those things, and maybe this is already addressed in current statute. How is that done? Number one, like how is that person coming to their assumption about what, or their belief about what these things are? And then how is that information gathered in a way that doesn't make the mandatory reporter feel like the response they give might impact how that report is evaluated? So like, is there, and I could see it could be done on an online way for sure, where there could be a comment that says this is purely for information gathering. The answers to this question, don't necessarily impact what the response will be, right? I don't know how clear I'm being, but I think this sort of concept of, if I'm reporting this, so if there's a certain race or ethnicity, or if there's a certain gender identity or whatever, somehow is that going to be responded to differently? And I don't think that's the intent. I think it's really to understand, but is there a way that that can be communicated to the reporter so they don't feel like somehow the report's going to be taken more or less seriously based on an answer to one of those questions?
Yeah, so one of the things that we did talk about, and we actually had an opportunity to look at, was the tool that the hotline uses in going through the series of questions. And I don't know, and maybe Yolanda or even Michelle could help add insight into this, like what the like prompt, the language is, and sort of framing up the demographic questions. But to the extent there is not sort of that language that says, we're going to ask you a series of demographic questions about the child and the family so that we can make sure that we capture that data. We're not going to use that for any decision-making purposes. So to the extent that there's not that language there already, I think that could certainly be added. But I'm going to make sure that I'm not speaking out of turn, Michelle or Yolanda, if there's, any additional context surrounding that, that topic, if you could chime in, that would be helpful. And then it looked like Dr. Wells, like you may have had another question.
Well, so as they chime in on that, I think kind of what Donna is saying, like the other question I always want to know is, what is this information based on, right? Is this based on what they identify as, or what your, the information so I think just maybe even that, like, and again, I don't know if it's part of the typical questions, but just sort of like, is this based on your interpretation or information that you gather directly from them? I really like the opportunity to confirm or correct demographic information, but that's a bit after the fact. It'd be interesting to know, what is that based on?
We're required to ask the information. Yolanda can correct me if I'm wrong. We like to give guidance to counties, or counties are given guidance about how best to ask those questions. However, I don't think it is where it needs to be. Just exactly what you said about, where is this information at? Is this your guess, or is this information that the family documented at the time they registered for school? What, so that information, do you know it? Do you not know it? And if you don't know it, then we can just say don't know. But I also think that there's other questions that we've talked about, like how did the family's race and ethnicity play a role in your decision to make a report today? Which I think I would love to ask. And I don't know that, as a child welfare system, we're trained to and or have language about that. It's also not done well at the time. If it's accepted for an assessment or an investigation, there really is not a good, there's not good, clear guidance to caseworkers on how to ask that information of families to say, hey, this is the demographic information we have. Is this accurate? Is this how you identify? This is why it's important to us to have this information. To your point, we're not going to make decisions about it, et cetera. So I think that we should draft some recommendation. I would encourage us to draft a recommendation that needs to be better trained to and or guidance provided about how to ask that information.
And I appreciate that, Michelle, because I think there could be some really compelling data too, right? In the distinction between what someone interprets, right? Because if let's say I see someone a certain way and they see themselves a different way, it might help us better understand, what is that sort of bias that occurs at the point of the mandatory reporter, right? As opposed to at the point of the system or, the child.
Thank you for that, Kathy and Michelle. I'm actually going to go in reverse order and call on Ashley first and then come back to you, Jessica. Ashley, if you're talking, you're not off mute.
Okay, my button's not working. I just realized. Sorry about that.
No problem.
I was just wondering why household income was included in this chart. I was hoping for some insight into that.
Yeah, so would love to have Jordan or Brian chime in also. But one of the things that we're wanting to get at is the socioeconomic issues and the conflation of poverty with neglect. So that can be a way of getting at that particular kind of information. But Brian, I see your hand is up. Do you want to over?
Yeah, I'm going to drop in the chat that this conversation came specifically from aligning current statute with the recently enacted SB 24200, which makes a requirement for CDHS to make an annual report that, if available, includes disaggregated data by a number of characteristics. So if you look at on page 4, there's a list of 8 different characteristics. We included those that are on this list from the new bill that aren't currently in statute at 193307. So that's just a copy pasting of those categories that weren't already included. That's the origin of these specific characteristics, is already enacted law.
Thank you, Brian. I liked my answer better.
I was just wondering.
That's the real answer, but my answer sounded better.
I had worried that it was sort of painting a target, so I guess that makes sense.
And we're open to changing that term. We were just struggling because some of the terms we used was like child income, and obviously a child doesn't have an income. So we were just trying to find something that aligned, but open to other suggestions, of course.
Thank you, Jordan. Jessica?
I think 2 fairly quick things. One of them is kind of on that same point, and it might just be that I don't know exactly what's currently collected. So we focus in that first bullet point on gathering additional characteristics about the child. I assume that's because we're already gathering those similar characteristics about the family, or I don't want to say perpetrator necessarily, that's a very prosecutorial term, but you know what I mean, to ensure that we're having data about, what the disproportionate reporting on certain folks that are, perpetrators. So I just didn't know if that was already being collected, but that we're being inclusive of that data would be helpful for everyone, right? Not only the child, but also the people involved, so that we can understand better how those mandatory reports are being, are impacting communities. The second one or second question is just more of if there was kind of a vision with the main bullet point 3, that families be given an opportunity to confirm demographic information. If there was kind of a vision or an idea, or maybe somebody from county or DHS can jump in on how that would happen, like when it would happen. When do the families are they given that opportunity? You know, as a lawyer, I think very like due process. How does that work? Is it that they can fill out a form in an office? Is that you know, they can contact the caseworker and say this should be corrected? I totally agree with it. I'm not like disagreeing with it. I'm just curious as to like the process, so I could better understand how it might look for people, so that they could be educated on here's how you do it, if that was envisioned at all.
I'm happy to take an initial stab and would love to have folks from the subcommittee chime in as well. But we really didn't settle on what the process would actually be for all reports coming in. Those reports that get screened out, we also wouldn't want to signal that someone reported on them and then, you know, nothing ultimately happened with that report. But for those cases that do get assigned, there's a worker that's making contact with that family. And so when the worker then makes contact with the family, instead of just going with what was initially entered in, which in practice probably happens more times than not, actually, you know, sort of providing a prompt or in some way in practice to revisit how families are identified when the worker's actually interacting with that family. So exactly what that looked like, we didn't talk about or figure out, but certainly in the instances where there is a worker that's making contact with the family, using that as an opportunity, not just to go down the, to initially just go into the report pieces, but also to use that to confirm the, you know, family characteristics.
This is Yolanda. I think that what you're describing in your or what you're bringing forth in your question is part of the rub and the challenge that child welfare faces around asking reporting parties for demographic information that then we may not have the chance to verify or confirm with the family if they are not assigned for further assessment to a caseworker. And yet then it's a struggle to know if we have accurate information demographically for families who've been referred to child welfare who haven't had an assessment or what people think of as an investigation, and that information hasn't been confirmed. Then the risk of putting the demographic information into the system at the point of hotline is that likely it's going to misidentify the family in one demographic category or multiple demographic categories, because we don't know how accurate from the point of the reporting party the information is. And so it is a challenge that child welfare faces around the accuracy of that information.
Yeah, thank you for that, Yolanda. So I'll just share really quick, and I don't want to take up a lot of time, but one thought that I had about doing that kind of validation of characteristics for those cases that are not assigned is using other DHS or even state resources to do some kind of a cross-matching. So as a way of cleaning up that data behind the scenes, exactly what that would look like, I have zero idea. The legal challenges or things like that, I have zero idea. But oftentimes we know that that information on the families exists in other systems, in other state-held systems. And we know that it's important to understand the experiences of families that get reported, so that we can identify the extent to which disproportionality and disparities is improving or not. But so that is a thought that I had on a way to validate that data on the back end. Yolanda?
Yes, thank you. I would just say one more challenge that we also experience is that if for some reason the demographic information is entered at the point of hotline based on what a mandatory reporter or otherwise had shared that may or may not be accurate, I think one of the risks we face, and we did talk about this in the sub-work group, is that a worker then may assume it is accurate because it's actually there in part of the client record, like race, ethnicity, sex sign at birth, gender expression, all of those characteristics / demographic markers may be inaccurate. And the caseworker may not realize that because they assume, oh, it's entered in there, so therefore it's been vetted or confirmed by the family. And that's an assumption that, you know, again, could lead us with inaccurate data. And so I think that being explicit in those recommendations about the mechanism that the caseworker, if there's one assigned to follow up and assess with the family, that there is a mechanism that ensures they will ask the family if the information already included in a client record is accurate for them, or if not, to change it to be accurate, or to just confirm what the reporting party said, you know, to make sure before it's entered that the family has a chance to vet that information. So there's like a critical step in there that I think the recommendations are trying to get to be proactive and have the family be able to confirm or to share their self-identification and not just rely on assumptions based on what the reporting party may or may not know accurately.
Thank you, Yolanda. All right, I want to get us through this last draft recommendation around the process for inter and intra-agency communications, confirming receipt of reports, and sharing the outcome of a report with certain mandatory reporters. So you'll notice in the first bullet that there is a line and that, you know, somebody should create and provide to county departments of Human Services regarding inter and intra-agency communications, these 4 bullets. But in an effort not to just make up something without having input from the task force, who that should be was intentionally left blank. And so I just want to call that out. And if folks have ideas around who that should be, please feel free to chime in. But want to open the floor for any you know, feedback, input, refinements to this set of draft recommendations. Michelle?
Me again, sorry.
Don't apologize. You're giving us good stuff.
The second bullet under, well, the first bullet, but the second point about the customized templates and for MOUs, Yolanda will have to correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought we had discussed the state already does have a template for the law enforcement MOUs. Yolanda, isn't that accurate?
Oh, there was something going on, Yolanda. So I can tell you, like from our prior conversation, the answer to that was yes. They're being updated right now. But yes, there was a template for MOUs specifically between law enforcement agencies and county departments of human services.
And they're like on a 4-year cycle. I think it's a 3 or 4-year cycle. And so
yeah,
we're in the it was this year that they were required to be redone by all counties. But I just don't think this is a necessary bullet point because it already exists. The template already exists. It's already given to counties. We already use that template. And then we turn back in all of the signed MOUs to the state and they maintain those on file.
Thank you, Michelle. Any other, Kathy?
So, can I talk about the second bullet?
Yeah.
Is this, so I don't know what this committee's role or influence is, but I guess, is there any recommendation around funding to support this? Because I know that, you know, the previous mandate the current mandate to say feedback to mandatory reporters to have an ongoing relationship. I think this is an expansion of that. Is that correct?
It is. And there is a template that's in Trails today that actually prompts creation of a standardized letter. And so this recommendation actually extends that to other mandatory reporters and not just specified mandatory reporters.
Because the reason I bring that up is in my experience as a mandatory reporter that was in that category of getting feedback, it really, really rarely happened. And what I often heard was because it was really an unfunded expectation. And I don't know if that challenge was really determining if I'm the mandatory reporter that should get the feedback as opposed to someone that shouldn't. And this opens it up so that it just makes it automatic, which I think sounds great. But I just wanted to sort of acknowledge that historically, at least in my experience, it was pretty rare. And not just me, right? I've talked to a lot of providers that would fit in that category and said, I've never gotten a letter, right? So I don't know if that challenge was really around determining who gets that and who doesn't, and then, sort of pulling the trigger and actually getting that sent. And then this would alleviate it because it's just an automatic response.
The current statute only requires it to be done for specified mandatory reporters, which is those with an ongoing relationship. So in the medical field, for sure, that would not be you unless you could make the case maybe as a pediatrician who sees the child regularly.
Right. That has like the ongoing pediatrician, and I talk to them all the time and they're like, we never get this.
So, and each county does it differently. The process for specified mandatory reporting is not consistent across all 64 counties about how that information is collected and then shared back out. And it puts the burden back on the reporting party to ask for the specified mandatory reporter to ask for the information in order to get it. It doesn't put the burden on the county to automatically provide it. So that's one issue. The second is that to Doris's point, they already have the capacity in Trails to be able to generate these letters. I think that our recommendation should be that it be a mandated requirement that the letter gets generated to all reporting parties post the disposition of a referral.
Thank you, Michelle. Crystal?
I just wonder if this is, I am very familiar with the whole conversation around unfunded mandates for agencies. And I just wonder if this could be somehow linked to the earlier recommendation around an electronic reporting tool. And, if people want a response, then they could leave, something that could be generated back via that electronic reporting tool. That would be more of a, standardized drop down, something for the agency that would go electronically. I'm trying to respond to the valid desire to hear back, but also respond to the big burden on agencies to do so much.
Thank you, Crystal. So just to clarify, this would be an automatically generated report based on this recommendation to all reporters on this basic information that's in the sub bullets. And currently in Trails, it already has the template. So I think, and Michelle, I think you're, probably, one of the best people to speak to this. It didn't seem like generating the report in Trails for all reporters would create an additional burden on the county offices.
Yeah, because a lot of counties, we get like the written reports from school districts that we then process and turn around and send back to schools. And so, no, I don't think, especially, representing the second, third largest county in the state, that would be an additional burden. And it would actually cut down on the call volume back to the hotline than saying what happened to the referral that I made, because I just want to document that. So we're already getting that. It's just not, it's whatever the saying is, 6 dozen, whatever, half a dozen in the basket, whatever that saying is. So I think it's fine. I don't think it's an additional burden to do it. And it already exists in Trails. It's just a matter of modifying that it goes out to all reporting parties, not just mandated or specified mandated.
Awesome. Thank you, Michelle. All right. I want to pass the baton to Trace. Oh, shoot. Y'all got a lot of stuff in this chat. Hold on. Okay. Okay. Just affirming some of what we said. Awesome. Any last comments, questions, concerns before Trace takes over?
Let's take a quick break. I got a note from two people separately. So why don't we just take a quick 5-minute run to the bathroom, get some water, shake your head from the data discussion. We'll move into specialized occupations. So we'll come back at 9:12. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
Doris, can you stop sharing if you're there? All right, y'all. Hopefully that was enough. Doris, if you want to stop sharing, I will bring these up on my end in just a moment, but I want to reshare the PDF for folks. So moving in for moving into specialized occupations. I think Doris stepped away for a minute. So, oh, there we go. Okay, thanks, Doris. All right, so moving into specialized occupations. Series of really great questions. Make sure that you pay attention. So this is the PDF that I shared earlier. Just scroll down to the specialized occupations subcommittee draft recommendations. I want to explicitly call out 7 and 11, just as a quick caveat, both for the subcommittee group and also for the larger group as a whole. So there was a conversation about a potential removal of victims advocates. There's also a discussion about delay in reporting, and we would write recommendations regardless of where we land. We would write recommendations around both, because a delay would still be a recommendation this group would be making, even if it, like, victims advocates doesn't include everyone, right? And so so that's kind of a standalone thing. So that'll make more sense once you read it, but just want to call it out. Jordan, I don't know if you can say that in a more clear way, but I just want to make sure folks are clear on why those are both in there.
Yeah, no problem. We just want to make sure that everyone knows it's not an and or. So it's not like we're proposing that we exclude victims advocates or don't, and then we do the delayed reporting in the alternative. The fact of the matter is we have to respond to all the directives, and this is the language in the directives. So we've included the removal of victims advocates in Directive 11 as an and, both. But there was discussion in our subcommittee group that the removal of that specific language on the list of mandatory reporters in the statute wouldn't necessarily encompass everyone that would be involved in Directive 7 or Directive 11. So we're not trying to distinguish, pick this or pick that. We're presenting all things for consideration.
I think that was better. Thanks, Jordan. Okay. Jennifer, I'm gonna ask, I'm sure it's a great point, but let's pause for a minute, and I want to make sure that we'll bring you in first. I just shared the PDF. If everyone can go, and I'm gonna give you till 9:20, so 6 minutes, to read through, again, specialized occupations, draft recommendations at the bottom of that document, and then we'll do a similar process to what Doris just did. So come back at 9:20 and drop me a note if you need more time. Thanks all. Yeah, and Jennifer, we'll get into that when I just wanted to make sure that people weren't like, wait a minute, are these duplicative? But yes, we'll get into that. Appreciate it. Hey, Sam, I'm dropping in the chat where we are.
Thank you.
All right, Doris, have you seen any notes or anything for requests for more time?
I have not.
Okay. All right, y'all. I'm gonna move us into this conversation then. If you can, come back on video if you're there. Great. If not, totally understand. I'm gonna go ahead and share screen. Just a reminder, we're gonna stick to each directive here. So if we start teetering into another, I might kind of course correct us, but just want to make sure we get through where we need to get through. So we've got 4 draft recommendations to get through for specialized occupations. And for those of you that kind of missed the beginning when we were talking, we're going to give a chance to the subcommittee members themselves, since this is your first time reviewing them as well, to make sure that we're not missing any glaring points from the discussion that was at hand. Going to try and keep away from any sort of wordsmithing at this point, unless it really changes the meaning or what we're trying to say. Otherwise, we'll keep this conversation moving. So I'm going to go ahead and share screen, which is the same content that you have in the PDF. All right, so Directive 7. Reporting timeframes for mandatory reporters who are creating a safety plan for victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking to ensure the safety of the victim and the victim's family members while creating the plan. So the challenge obviously presented here was that when you're required to make a report within X amount of hours, currently that can put some things that can put folks at risk. It can challenge the relationship. It can challenge just some of the like technicalities of supporting folks across the spectrum was really the conversation had there. And so, Jordan, I want to saw you come off mute. So go ahead, Jordan, and then I want to get into.
No problem. So I just wanted to point out that we put the exemption for victims advocate under Directive 11 solely because that is where the subcommittee addressed it in our discussions. If we wanted to move it up to Directive 7, it could live in either place. We could list it in both places, just to be very clear. When Brian and I were drafting, however, we just kind of tried to align with the discussion. But I want people to know that it's on the table for both Directive 7 and Directive 11.
Thanks, Jordan. So really the underlying piece here, and Jennifer, appreciate that point here. We can, yeah, we'll make note of that as the request, unless someone feels like they have an issue with that. But I think that makes sense. So really that in the instances named here, you know, for folks that are involved in creating a safety plan for victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking, to ensure the safety of the victim, the victim's family members while creating a safety plan. In those instances, mandatory reporters will be required to make a report within 72 hours. So want to just throw it first to our subcommittee members. Anything here as it relates to this particular conversation that you feel like is missing before we open it up to the full group? And I will just add that the conversation was like, you know, 24, 48, 72, and the folks that you know, we heard from a panel of folks both on the committee, but also they were just like, you know, 72 would be ideal if there's a delay at all, like, you know, because someone was like, what about 48? And they were like, yeah, 72. So that's where this number kind of came from, just FYI to folks. Stephanie?
Great. So I was a member of this subcommittee, and Teresa, I think it might be helpful just to give fuller context. Jordan already has, in large part, talking about how this conversation is not only about timeframes, extending them for advocates to make reports, but the conversation our task force also had was about exempting advocates completely from the requirement of mandated reporting. And I'm repeating what Jordan said, so just bear with me. I just want this committee to know that we had very robust discussions about these two issues. And then Trace, I don't know, I believe we did a survey on this as well. I just want to give the task force full context to how this directive rose and which directives, you know, why they rose to the top and so forth. So I think it might just be helpful because this is a super important one. They all are important, but this one definitely took our task force a lot more time. We had some really robust discussions, and I just really want to respect the advocate community who was part of these discussions, just to lay out a little bit of background, that's all.
Yeah, yeah. And definitely welcome members of the subcommittee to kind of give some of that context. But Jordan, I was just about to pull that up. So 80% of the respondents voted as being supportive of moving this forward. So this one was something that, there was like Stephanie said, a robust discussion around like what, I think the main underlying thing I would say from my perspective was not creating more challenges than solutions in any of these recommendations. And so it's really important to hear from folks that actually do this work, that are kind of in the trenches, if you will, to say like, this is what we need. And so of course there were some questions around process and are we creating additional challenges and whatnot, but some really strong voices from the advocacy field came out to say, these are the things that explicitly would be extremely helpful, just given the actual lived experience we have as professionals and people. We also had folks speaking from personal experience as well, on the victim side as well. So just want to name that too. So thanks, Stephanie. Jennifer, jump in, and then want to make sure we open to the full group too. I can't, sorry, you're on mute, Jennifer.
Oh, good grief. I was going to kind of jump in and explain kind of from where Stephanie was speaking. So we have two different issues here. One is anyone who is working to create a safety plan for victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking would have up to 72 hours after starting to work with the person to make a report to help them get safe before involving child welfare or law enforcement. And then victim advocates are a separate category. And when we're talking about victim advocates in this context, it is a very narrow group of people. The statute that's referenced later is victim advocates who work at a program that specifically serves victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking, and are required to have a certain number of hours of training in order to be a confidential victim advocate with victim advocate privilege under the statute. So what we're proposing is that those victim advocates, the folks who meet those definitions under the statute, are exempt from reporting. And other people, whether they are teachers or therapists or doctors or whoever, that are working with a victim of domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking, have extra time to report in order to help that person get connected to shelter or other services or whatever the case may be before involving any other systems.
Thanks, Jennifer, for that kind of the clarification piece. Jade, go ahead and jump in.
Yeah, I think just building on that. So a victim advocate that works for a law enforcement agency or a victim advocate that works for the prosecutor's office, those would not be exempted, but they would have the extra 72 hours.
That's the intention as I understand it. Yes.
Yeah, so really this is about the logistics of that sort of support, the delay being just a more process piece of giving them more time. Doesn't mean that in, again, kind of, I think part of the conversation was around professional judgment too, but giving them the space should they need it to make the 72 hours. That doesn't mean that, that someone wouldn't make a report immediately or within the 24 hours, et cetera. But it just means like in those specific cases where it would be beneficial for the family or the victim that they're working with, that they have some of that time to get some of those pieces in place. Jade, that's kind of where that came from. Michelle, go ahead.
I hate to add complexity, but I think we need to be more clear here based on this conversation. And I don't know how or if this applies to educators. We do safety plans in schools for a myriad of reasons, but I think they're different from what you all are talking about here. So I wouldn't even know where to begin with training my folks on this extension. Again, agree with the reasons for it, just not clear on who it applies to.
Appreciate that. So I think just the clarity of, making sure that folks understand who's included, who's not included.
Does it apply to educators? Would be a question for my benefit.
I think when the directive was written originally, it was done with broad intention because of the kind of community and the stakeholders that would be involved in doing safety plans. So I think that was the intention when the legislation was drafted. So in response to that directive, I'd say that it was encompassed, but we can certainly add language to make it more explicit when we move into redrafting the recommendation. Or we can
And
just
maybe it's more around what you mean by safety plan. I'm not sure, and I'm sorry I missed these discussions on the subcommittee.
So, I think the short response is it's definitely up for discussion. Should it include those safety plans in the school? That's kind of why we've written it broadly, so we can see what this group wants to include in it.
Yeah, I'd be interested to take this back to my folks and get some more context too, to be more helpful for the rest of the group.
Jennifer and Stephanie.
I think in terms of what we intended as a subcommittee, this was meant to apply to all mandatory reporters. I think what you're speaking to, Michelle, is a training issue. You know, if an educator is aware that domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking is the issue, and maybe they're helping the parent get connected to services, get connected to a shelter or whatever support they might need, having that delay in time to let that person make that connection. But I think there's a huge training gap there that makes this complicated, and I think there's a lot more to this issue, as you alluded to, that is hard to address in this particular directive.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks, Michelle. Stephanie, jump in and then Roshan.
Yeah, appreciate the conversation. And just by way of, I don't know, some background, this issue initially came up 2 years ago when this legislation for the task force was being drafted. And Jennifer Isle, you and I, right, were in touch quite a bit at that point. And the issue at that time was very specific about advocates, domestic violence, sex assault advocates designed to assist families, period. And I remember I received some really important information from our advocates talking about how we're one of very few states remaining who still require advocates to be mandated reporters. So just to give you context, at that time, that was the limited issue on the table, and that is how this directive got added to the statute. We never discussed other types of advocates, for better or for worse. So if that gives anybody a little bit of idea, at least why we have this in the statute, and what was contemplated at that time. I appreciate that there may be a lot more specificity that needs to go into that so that we're clear about whom we are talking about.
Roshan?
Yeah, Stephanie, I think I appreciate that history because, yeah, that was in some ways our original request at the task force level, or at that level, was could we create the delay if we can't remove DVSA advocates, like confidential community-based advocates. And so I think just to clarify, like Jen's point is right, since we are asking to remove them, in some ways it does counter that original request, because that wasn't really who we were talking about in those original requests. And now this applies to folks that we weren't talking about in the original request a few years ago. I mean, I voted for this. I agree with this. I do have some concerns because I think this question you're raising, Michelle, about safety planning really matters here. You know, in a school, we use the term like safety plan usually around like self-harm, violence to others, right? You're creating a safety plan because someone has a gun in a school. Like you're doing things that are really about community safety more than what we're talking about, which is once you report, the danger goes up a lot for the survivor. So how do we make sure the survivor can be in a safer place when that report is made? Yes, the statute
comes up in the school setting, though, right? If we're
reporting, yeah, absolutely.
The student's going to go home, and we're not sure that action will be taken that day. That's why, yeah,
right. Yeah, and you have all kinds of requirements around how you do a threat assessment and a safety plan. Like there's a whole set of things that you that like when we just say this one word, it like activates for you. So I hear that.
Correct. Thank you.
You know, I wonder if there's any guidance here around the medical, you know, the mandatory reporting for medical folks, which I've raised a few times in here, requires that you actually connect to a community-based advocate. And so I do wonder if there's something we could say about domestic violence safety planning. Yolanda, I hear your question too about sort of like proof and how do we know that a person is safe, or, and even when you safety plan, that doesn't necessarily mean that everything's going to happen. Like you can't say, I'm going to send you away and have you call for shelter, and then in 10 minutes you have shelter. Like you may get turned away because we don't have enough beds. So, you know, so safety planning isn't a perfect solution either. It's a process. So I don't know, maybe I'm just raising more questions, but I do wonder about applying this to folks who don't have the expertise around safety planning in DV and SA. And so it does feel to me, and this is probably something I should have said earlier, sorry, I sort of had it on my mind, but maybe we should include either language like safety planning with an advocate from a, you know, with a community-based advocate. That language might help so that you're not putting a burden on, you know, a teacher or, you know, somebody who's got different kinds of expertise, right, to take on a new kind of, you know, learning and safety process. Or maybe it doesn't apply here, because I can sort of see, I don't want to undermine the expertise and the delicacy of the kind of safety planning we're talking about by just saying like, oh, just do that, you know, either.
I think I think to move us on, what I would say here is that we need to be crystal clear in who we're talking about. And I think that also is spelled out in the directive. Seems like, and Jordan, feel free to, that feels like the easiest, like that's the lane that all of our conversations were in, was like the DV SA piece, as people have said. And so like, can we just be more explicit in this to clarify who we're talking about, and keep it in that space? Because again, thinking about the scope of this task force, what the intention was behind the original legislation sort of thing, just like making sure that we're reflective of that in our language.
Yeah, I think that's more than fair, Trace. I think if there's folks who have language that would help even narrow it, to avoid kind of that expansion, that would be really helpful. But yeah, I think we can definitely do that.
Yeah, I think we could come back to like a Roshan and a Jennifer for you all to kind of like, I think there's probably language, I'm guessing, that would clarify like who we're talking about here. And then Michelle, as an example, we could bounce it off of you of like, is this clear then that this would not like somehow bleed into an arena that we were not intending to?
Yeah, and I don't know when our next meeting is, but I'd love to take it back to my folks and learn a little bit more about what it looks like. Because part of me is like, let's not give educators this exemption and let's just have them report. Because I'm just concerned that we're not going to get, I don't know, I'm concerned that, I'll just leave it, period. I'm concerned. So I'd love to, Jordan, circle back with you with what I learned, and maybe we can frame that into possible recommendations.
That would be great, because it could be as simple as like stating what it doesn't include instead of trying to define what it does include, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
All right, I want to move us on, but Sam, I see your hand up, so I'm going to come to you first, and then we'll get on to the next one.
I think I'm a little confused, so I want to make sure that I'm saying clearly what I'm wanting. I do recognize, I think Roshan kind of said it, there should be an exemption for advocates whose title and whose primary role is in DV and stalking. But I also want to say this delay is to protect families. And I've worked in DV enough in a variety of hats where that wasn't my title. And I think it's important that that delay is accessible or is applied to anyone who is doing safety planning, even if that isn't the norm for their role. So I just wanted to say that because I wasn't sure if we're going away from this being a directive or an item. So I want to make sure that we keep it there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Sam. I appreciate the clarification there just on priority. And yeah, absolutely, as it relates to this directive, sticking in that lane. So okay, I'm going to move us on if everybody's cool with that. I'm going to drop it to the chat and then bring back up to the screen. I like just being able to see everybody's faces, so I'm going to toggle between the two, but moving on to the next directive. Curious, again, from folks. So Directive 10, whether a mandatory reporter who is employed by an agent of or a contractor for an attorney who is providing legal representation exempt from the reporting requirements. The group recommends amending statute to clarify that mandatory reporters who are employed by are exempt from the reporting requirements described in section XYZ. This was the one, I believe, someone correct me if I'm wrong, this was the one that had 100% approval from our group, just as an FYI to the larger group. So any clarification from the subcommittee itself, and then let's open it up to the wider group. Go ahead, Jennifer.
I just wanted to say, I thought we had agreed as a group that it should be legal services and not legal representation. That makes a really important difference. Representation would be that the person is actually engaging the services of the attorney, where services might be a person is calling a law firm and speaking to an advocate who does the intake. We want to make sure that at that stage, that the attorney-client privilege piece that we're talking about here already applies, not only when representation is happening.
I don't think we went to that point explicitly, but would love to dive in with our members.
We discussed it in the last 2 meetings.
I know, I don't think we agreed. And so I just would love to make sure we're getting clarity on that here.
Yeah, what are folks? Michelle, go ahead, jump in.
Can I just hear from Ashley or others around the thought behind excluding guardian ad litem from being a mandated reporter? I know they're not currently in a statute. I just would like to hear some perspective from that lens about excluding them.
Sure. As you mentioned, they're not mandated reporters now. They're licensed attorneys, so they are, I mean, they are bound by the attorney ethics, which confidentiality and duty of loyalty are some of the main tenets. Even though a guardian ad litem has a little bit different application of those duties, they still exist for the attorney. So I think that's one thing that people often misunderstand. A guardian ad litem still has the same duties. Their duties are to the best interest of the child. So while you may think that a guardian ad litem is sharing information at will, that's not true. There's a whole thought process that goes into what can be shared and what can't based on the client, which is the best interest of the child. So it is a little bit more flexible, but it's still important that these attorneys are treated the same. I mean, guardian ad litems are not non-legal advocates for a reason in Colorado. There are many states where guardian ad litems are not attorneys, and having them be attorneys is a really important part of that role. And those professional ethics are key to that, even in that different sort of application. And then when it comes to the legal team itself, you know, best practices are that we work with social workers and other people with social sciences backgrounds as part of our multidisciplinary legal teams. There's a lot of research about how that's the best fit for families and children. And the reality is just that an attorney could not ethically work with that person if they were a mandatory reporter. They need to be bound by the attorney's ethical obligations instead, which again doesn't mean they couldn't report. It just means that you have to go through the ethical sort of thought processes before you decide what can be reported, what can't, and that kind of thing. So I'm going with the very high level cliff notes, but that's sort of the thinking there.
Thank you.
Any other questions here? Again, this is and Jennifer, I appreciate your point, but this is the language that we surveyed with exactly as it's written here. So I just want to make sure we're sticking to that as what the subcommittee is pushing forward as a draft recommendation. So was there any sort of question or concern about the directive as it's written, the recommendation as it's written? Jennifer.
Yeah, I'm just going to renew my concern that the word representation limits this in a way that is really problematic.
Was there, I'm curious, as someone who voted on this survey, so this is the language that we used previously. Is that something Because I don't, I'm just thinking from my perspective, I don't remember that conversation explicitly. And so I'm just wondering, is that something that's just kind of come up in reflection or what?
No, I actually raised this issue when Chris Henderson and, oh God, I'm forgetting, presented with Chris, I'm so sorry. And they said, yes, that we would agree with that change to the language. And I see Jessica nodding. Jump in, Jessica, please.
Yeah, I kind of recall, I do recall that conversation. And I was looking for, I don't see Kevin Bishop on the call.
No, that's, yeah, Kevin's not, which is unfortunate.
But yeah, but I do recall, and I mean, Kevin and I get along great. We understand each other's positions that, you know, in terms of how, you know, private representation works, right? Especially just, I think Jennifer's correct, right? There's a nuance and a difference between representation and practice, right? Once you get into a contract, that's one thing, but usually lawyers go through a consultation, or they might have reviewed, you know, information before that is done, that really for the purposes, or they might have a paralegal, you know, talking with somebody, or a social worker. I know is now public defenders and ADC are consistently employing social workers, you know, that might be meeting with somebody technically, you know, before the person qualifies for the public defender or qualifies for ADC. So I think in the realm of giving life to that, we all agree that there should be this expansion to agents of attorneys, that that it fits to say, you know, who is you know, that we should wordsmith it correctly, so as that we're not limiting ourselves just to representation. I don't know, Stephanie, what do you think?
Yeah, I was gonna ask Trace a question.
Yeah.
And the question is this, right? Does this group go through the literal directive as it is stated and answer the question as it has been posed? Or does the group do an and both? Like, we agree with the directive, right? There should be this exemption for people, staff who are currently being, you know, under representation. And the task force also identified a further concern, which is that there are other staff not necessarily engaged in representation at that moment. Like, right? Representation is a moment in time. It's a meeting of the minds, right? It's a changing of money. It's all of that. It's a signing of a contract, agreeing to representation. And so I guess my question is, we could technically go outside of all these directives, because
Right.
we all identified a lot more depth than was originally intended when this task force was formed. So from a policy perspective, do you answer the directive and say, and for further discussion, the task force identified these concerns because a legislator will pick this up, right? And I could see them saying, oh, great, we want to clarify the statute about all those agents connected with representation. Oh, and we should probably contact the rest of the community who are on this screen and beyond, and see, does any potential change also need to include X, Y, Z? So I'm just trying to think of it as a process perspective. And I think then we have to just take guidance. Like, if we as a group say, no, we have to answer the directive, but we can always put in, and for legislative consideration, think of A, B, and C. I just don't want us to be unresponsive to the law and the statute as it's written. I also don't want to shortcut something that requires deeper either discussion or actual implementation. Because we would have wasted a lot of time and a lot of good minds if we don't share with people what we've learned and how the law still needs to change beyond what's been directed. That's my question to you.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. I appreciate all the, I think it's super helpful. So I think I'm going to do two things. One, backing up to Jennifer's point, and then kind of other folks clarifying. That's super helpful, because I'm kind of like, okay, we surveyed around this, and I'm trying to remember. So that's super helpful to remember that conversation. I think the easiest way through this particular language piece is that we can just, we can do one of each as far as surveying goes, and then we can see where the consensus is on the language itself as it relates to the directive. So that'll be the easiest way to kind of move that forward. And Jennifer, appreciate you calling that out, and folks just, it's getting back to that. So we can kind of do a either or, and then see where folks land when we do the survey. To Stephanie's point, it's a great point, and that's exactly, I think the other way that we've said that kind of in past discussions is the narrative of the report will always be reflective of the conversations, regardless of the specific directive that comes up as it relates to the recommendation as it relates to the directive. So in the case where we're answering this directive, and yeah, like you said, for legislative, consideration, here are the additional points. I think there's going to be a lot of that. There's actually one of those in here in the last directive around, we think this is beyond the scope of this task force, and this was the discussion that was had. So absolutely, we'll be capturing that in addition to the directives themselves. So appreciate that call out. All right, I'm going to move us along because I do think with that language piece, which seems to be the only thing that really came up here, we'll have a pretty quick way to move forward on consensus, which is just writing an example of each and then seeing where folks land. So we will do that in additional surveying to get to the final recommendation. Are folks cool with that? Okay, cool. Moving us on. Also, if there are members of the public on that would like to provide public comment, can you send me a note now? I don't see anyone, but let me know if there's anyone that would provide public comment. Otherwise, I'm going to take us to the full hour. All right, so moving on to Directive 11. This is around mandatory reporters who have knowledge or reasonable cause to know or suspect that a child or youth is the victim of dating violence or sexual assault. Recommendation around amending statute to modify mandatory reporting requirements for reporters who have knowledge or reasonable cause to know that a child or youth is the victim of dating violence or sexual assault. In these instances, mandatory reporters will be required to make a report within 72 hours. Did I do the wrong one? No, here we go. Okay, yeah. Oh, sorry, it's the explicit call out around child and youth. Right. I forget that it's written almost the exact same. I was like, wait a minute, I just read the same thing. All right, so members of the subcommittee, any clarification here? Anything we're missing that you feel like was discussed? Clearly my brain, I need your help on this. Anything that we're leaving out before we open it to full group?
I apologize. I probably should have said this earlier. And I don't know how to write it or if it's a training issue, but I want to be mindful of, I can know that someone was assaulted and that could have been 2 years ago. Like just that nuance of knowing someone was assaulted doesn't mean I have to make a report depending on when that assault occurred. So I don't know how to name that reality. But it is a big part of doing this work and working like with one of my hats on of like my sexual health educator hat that kids will report or parents will report my kid was assaulted and this was what happened or whatever the case may be. So I don't know how to name that reality that I'm not going to report anything because it's old.
Thanks for that, Sam. I'm going to go Jennifer, Jade, and then Michelle.
Yeah, and thanks, Sam. I think that's a huge piece of this. And there is just so much nuance here that I think is not addressed in a recommendation, which is around things like if a teenager is seeking support around a sexual assault by a peer that is not otherwise that is a peer. Let's just leave it at that. The fact that someone has to report that to law enforcement against that teenager's wishes flies in the face of a lot of other statutes we have. Like kids can access medical care, they can access mental health services at age 12, and then we're saying if you go to somewhere to get support, a school counselor to get support around a sexual assault, that then law enforcement is going to be involved whether you want it or not, and therefore parents might be involved and so forth. We actually just updated the civil protection order statute this year to allow for minors to be able to get protection orders without having an adult or did we, Rashan? we discussed it. Oh, now I can't even remember what we landed on. But anyway, this is an ongoing issue. And the same with teen dating violence. If we've got 2 15-year-olds and there's teen dating violence, do we want to call the police? I think there's just a lot of nuance here. There's a lot to unpack, and there's just a lot more to this issue than this particular directive is really getting at this point. And I'm just going to stop there.
Thanks, Jennifer, for sharing your thoughts there. Jade, you had your hand up and then it went down. Do you want to jump in or?
Yeah, I can't decide. I think I'm trying to understand the same kind of question I asked earlier because I agree with you, Jennifer. I'm wearing my mom hat and I'm sitting here thinking, if something happened to my daughter and now, now you're telling me child welfare might be involved and law enforcement might be involved and I think I'm just trying to make sure I'm understanding what the recommendation is. I understand the recommendation is we take out victim advocates, but that doesn't then necessarily take out the school counselor or kind of some of those other people she might go to. And yeah, I'm just trying to make sure I'm really clear on what the recommendation is and what it is that we're then opening kids up to if they're not comfortable with that. And when it's a child welfare issue.
Yep. Does anybody want to? Or go ahead, Kathy, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, or law enforcement issue. Right?
Yeah, I'm curious if anybody from our subgroup wants to jump in and give any context as to how we, again, this is kind of when we surveyed, this is where we landed. So would love for folks to kind of push on, yeah, what was your thinking here?
I would just I think part of the challenge is they're minors, right? That they're, so the balance of the level of protection for a minor that if it's an assault, it's a crime. And so, but I put in the chat, this is a challenge in the clinical setting as well, right? Someone seeks care. We want them to get appropriate health care. And yet, if that results in a report to law enforcement or child welfare, and they don't want it to be reported, they may not, obviously come for care. But I think that where our discussion really landed was that at the end of the day, they're minors and, but I don't know, someone else in the group can sort of comment on that.
Yeah, I'll say, and yeah, because I'm trying not to just insert like my takeaway from that, but that did come up a lot, the minors piece, and also like versus a public safety issue was another thing that folks were kind of weighing in this discussion of like when you're working with like, this was the broader conversation around like in the school setting of like, again, we're talking about kids here versus a situation with like an adult victim and what the difference is there and like what our priorities are around safeguarding around kids versus like, yeah, a kid might not want that, but what is our like, what do we believe that we need to do in those situations was kind of, I think where I saw some wrestling. We're coming up on time, but I want to make sure, right, I'm just going to, let's just go through our points here. And then I think this will be a good spot to pause and we can pick this discussion back up. So Michelle Dossi, go first.
Just really quick, we've talked about this before. I can't remember in either subgroups or a larger group that how long ago was the sexual assault or domestic violence and when it should be reported. Mandated reporters are constantly confused about if it happened 5 years ago, 2 years ago, or it happened last night. Has it already been reported? Sometimes families will say, yes, it has been when it hasn't been. It causes duplicative reports, which means families have more history stacked against them when it gets reported over and over and over again when people see various professionals. So I think we have to discuss that as this task force about, is there a time frame of how far in the past can reporting parties confirm it was reported without having to report, et cetera.
Thanks, Michelle. Michelle Murphy.
Yeah, also quick, I think we just need to clarify, there's some confusion between Directive 7 and this one, at least around now. It seems like regardless of whether educators, because most of our folks are children, regardless of whether we're creating a plan, when there's a sex assault, we have 72 hours. So Just want to make sure I'm reading that right and that it's clarified.
Thanks for that, Michelle. Jessica, Gina, and then Stephanie, and then Sam, and let's close it out. And I appreciate folks giving us just like an extra minute or two.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hoping we're gonna have a lot of time in the next meeting to talk about this one, because I do think that this created, I think, some of the most robust conversation in our subcommittee. You know, from the prosecutor's standpoint, you know, I expressed concerns, we had concerns. I don't think it's 100% no, victim advocates shouldn't be removed from mandatory reporting. But, you know, I think some of the points that I thought were important to make, to consider, kind of are put together and shown up and enlightened by this conversation, right? It's a pretty slippery slope to then say, okay, well, if people who are connecting others with services, you know, are required to report, then that turns away people from services. Well, that's most of mandatory reporters. Right. And so victim advocates, I think we had a really good discussion about how very specifically when they come into the process and how they act as a way to bridge to other services, and how that was very specific to their needs to not have to report. So I thought, you know, just an important context as we're talking about teachers and other folks, that we really heard a lot of compelling information from our advocates about their specific work as a bridge to other services, and the work that they can do to explain, you know, how mandatory reporters might come into play as part of the, you know, the services and the systems, but that they would benefit from not having to report right away. I do think that, or report at all. I think there were some nuances there. You know, I'll give out that my position, our prosecutor's like position was more like, if there was a 72-hour time frame plus the exemption for reporting for, say, 15 to 17-year-olds, that would address a lot of the things and might be kind of a compromise recommendation. I don't see that in here. I would love to see that in here, because I thought that was an important part of our discussion, was that there was concern about, well, what about victim advocates talking to a parent of a 12-year-old and the mom doesn't want to have the report done because dad's the offender and the breadwinner? That's a big problem. And they don't want to go get services then because they're nervous about going to other mandatory reporters. But the dynamics of DV and sexual abuse, especially on younger children, I thought were important to note. So anyways, I know we're gonna have more time, but I just want to lodge that.
Yeah, we are definitely going to need more time. So I just want to name that for folks, that we will revisit this. And honestly, this is a great discussion. I think, like, if I could guess, the subcommittee is probably relieved that, because this was a really sticky one, right? Like, this was a big discussion in the subcommittee. So I think having the full group's eyes on this is super helpful. Just going to name, we're over time, we're losing folks. So Gina, Stephanie, and Sam, feel free to, we're going to come back to this, but if there anything that is a comment right now that would be helpful to kind of wrap up, please do so. So Gina first, then Stephanie, then Sam, then let's close it out.
Totally. Thank you. Most of what I was going to say was just going to mirror what Jessica kind of alluded to. Also, I will go back and gather some more information around some specifics with sexual violence and especially in teens. That's a huge concern of ours in terms of that, which Jessica kind of named there. I just wanted to also just lift up that teens exist in a very difficult kind of area in terms of age range, because oftentimes they are too old for CAC and then too young for the adult crisis shelter. So they live in this really difficult limbo that we are hoping to address through being able to do this, also to align this exemption with the existing statute for advocates to maintain their confidential relationship with survivors, and just to try to help align that for the professionals in our field, and to help us as the folks who do the training and TA with our advocates, to help them navigate how to do these things, has been a huge has been a huge kind of training topic for us. But I'll also say, as much as it's a training topic, we're also very proud of how our agencies have been going about addressing these concerns currently, and doing so knowing that they have those obligations to report. So I just wanted to lift that up and say that, you know, just wanting to advocate on behalf of our agencies statewide that these folks are fully trained to go into this, however folks come out of this. And I appreciate all of these questions, and I will work very diligently to come back to this next meeting with some more information to help us continue on this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gina. I appreciate the data call out to Jessica in the chat. So anything you can bring forward on that would be great. Stephanie?
Yeah, again, we'll continue the conversation. I think what we just need to note is this. Legally, the definition of child abuse, right? The entire definition, like the ones that span pages, is that reports must be made for people who are under 18, who fit a variety of literally 40 different crimes, period, right? So if this discussion goes in a different direction, you will be fundamentally changing the definition of what constitutes child abuse. One of the biggest misunderstandings we hear is people think child abuse is one, physical abuse, and two, it's committed by an adult on a child, which is not what the statute says. It's when an act is committed on a child under age 18 of a certain laundry list of crimes. So I only point that out by saying it's really even beyond this directive. If the task force goes in a different direction than just answering the directive, it's as deep as we need to change the definition of child abuse, for example, to change the age from not 18, but 15 to 18, or we have to change acquaintance sex assault and lift that out of the existing list. So there is nothing wrong with those considerations. I just want to highlight it's a little bit deeper than even just the directive. You would be fundamentally altering the statutory scheme. Again, it could be a very appropriate conversation. I just want to highlight that.
Thanks for that, Stephanie. Sam is going to be our last comment just because we do need to call on time. So Sam, go ahead and close us out, and then we'll continue this discussion.
Thank you for letting me speak. I apologize. I know I missed some of the subcommittee conversation around this, so I'm jumping in late. I think something I just want to highlight is one of the goals of this commission is to address disproportionate impact. And when we know that certain people, Black and Brown people in teen dating violence relationships and what those reports might look like are different than with white people in teen dating violence or sexual assault accusations and so on and so forth. And so I want to be mindful that we aren't allowing disproportionate representation in thinking specifically around sexual assault and teen dating violence. And instead, we're trying to get ahead of it because the data is there. And we know that reality, and we know how teens date today is also drastically different than how they dated 10 years ago. And I think in particular of what stalking.
Sam, you muted yourself, I think, of the very particular.
Oh, I said what stalking looks like today is very different than what it might look like 10 years ago. So just that reality of who is going to become the victim and who's going to become the perpetrator based on the report that I make versus the reality of a situation.
Thanks, Sam. I appreciate you bringing back to center too the conversation around disproportionate impact and how that might exist in this sort of recommendation. All right, y'all. Well, I really appreciate the folks that were able to hang on. Again, we have this recorded, so for the folks that jumped off, we'll invite them to kind of review the remainder conversation. We've got more work to do on this. I really appreciate the conversation. I think it's obviously a sticky one. It's very personal for a variety of reasons to folks. So I just really appreciate the mutual respect in the conversation and allowing us to kind of pull on one another as always. So much appreciation. Gonna let y'all jump off. I don't think I've ever been over like this on this group, so it had to happen at least once. So thanks for your patience. And we'll follow up via email. There might be some potential surveying or something between now and the next meeting to kind of help us narrow more on a few things. So keep a lookout for that. Otherwise, really appreciate y'all and have a great rest of your week. Take care.